And I also would acknowledge the so if I be able to present the good work to also her credit. Anyway, so John chapter 20, verses 1 and 10 is the only gospel text of its kind. The passage is straightforward and fairly simple. The translator will make decision of how best to render in English what the Greek text says, word by word. Most published translations of John chapter 20, verses 1 through 10, render the Greek text in a straightforward manner, that is, without thought to other issues that might influence the translation. However, issues like themes operating within the gospel, special terms, multiple meanings of words, and coherence with other passages must be taken into account. A translated sentence can give us what a certain set of words in another language might mean. What we are really after is that particular meaning intended by the writer, chosen from among all the options. Most translators give us a simple rendering of John chapter 20, verses 6 and 7. For example, what is on the screen? Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. This translation is from the English Standard Version. But inconsistencies and unanswered questions arise from this straightforward translation of John chapter 20, verses 1 through 10, in isolation from the other issues. We should bear the following in mind. The first, that in certain parts the meaning of the Greek text is ambiguous. Second, that sometimes Greek words themselves have more than one possible meaning. Third, further, this Greek text of verse 7 describes something unique with no parallel. Never in the history of the world, before or since the event described, were there witnesses at the tomb scene like this one, where a body was missing and burial cloths were still present in a particular configuration. The beloved disciple John had to find words to describe what no one had described before. There was no standard way to say it. Literally, he said of the sudarion, it was rolled up, quote, in one place, close quote. This is clearly an idiom, an expression that is not to be taken strictly literally. So, while translations provide their simple rendering of the sentences, commentaries, journal articles, and other scholarly writings move beyond the simple rendering to discuss the full range of meaning and to determine which option is best. That kind of investigation is before us now. So, themes in John. The Gospel of John is a masterpiece of thematic development, starting with the prologue, where we first encounter the dualistic theme of light and darkness. Closely related to this is another theme, sight and blindness. This theme is notably illustrated in chapter 9, when a man born blind is healed by Jesus. He also came to see that Jesus is from God, while the authorities remain spiritually blind, unable to perceive the truth. In chapter 20, it is the beloved disciple who sees that Jesus has been raised, not just removed from the tomb. Quote, he saw and believed, close quote, says the text of verses 8. Though he did not yet realize that the scriptures had foretold this. The truth was revealed to him. The themes of light and darkness and sight and blindness must not be forgotten when we read John chapter 20. Unusual words. Words chosen by John carry the story. He's a master of word use. And we must not fail to recognize this as we search for the intended meaning of the passage before us. Concerning verses 6 and 7, the highly renowned scholar Raymond Brown said, quote, "Almost each word must be considered," close quote. And he said this in the Gospel according to John 31-21 by the Anchor Yale Bible Commentary Series, 2007, page 986. Let's consider some of them now, some of the words used by John. Theoreo and blepo, observe and see. The Greek of John's Gospel has Peter observing, theorei, the appearance of the burial cloths. It is only the beloved disciple who sees, blepe. Please note carefully, Peter does not necessarily see the sudarion with his eyes. He observes it rolled up, quote, in one place, close quote. If you were to put your hand in your pocket right now, the person next to you could observe your hand in your pocket, but without ever seeing your hand. To the surprise of the cursory reader and also the straightforward translator, the verb theorei does not provide a sure basis for saying that Peter ever actually saw the sudarion with his eyes, though that remains a possible reading of the text. Kemai, rest, recline. The burial linens which we logically take to be a shroud and one or more thigh bands are described as keimena, a participle of kemai, with the usual meaning of reclining or resting. A few scholars have understood this verb to mean that the burial cloths were flattened, pressed down. Whether one accepts this or not, the cloths are at the very least in an orderly resting position. Heis, one. The Greek word for one is heis. Its inflected form in verse 7 is hena. The lexicon, like the one by Bauer, Walter, William F. Arndt, and F. Wilbur Gingrich, a Greek and English lexicon of the New Testament and other early Christian literature, Chicago University Press of Chicago Press, 1957, furnishes numerous meanings and nuances for heis, one. The patient and persistent researchers who pursues the lengthy lexical entry to the end will discover that heis can in some circumstances be regarded as an ordinal. Thus, it can mean first, though that would not be the usual way to translate the word. But again, there is nothing usual about the sight being described by John and no usual way to say it. Entulisso, fold, roll. The sudarion is described by a participle of entulisso, which may mean rolled or folded. Whether rolled in a fashion like the old Boy Scout neckerchief or folded square, these point to order, not chaos at the tomb. Some have imagined that Jesus folded the cloth himself and left it in the open as a sign to his followers. But that not only imports an untold action into the story, it raises the question of why he did not also change the arrangement of the other burial cloths, and why of this folding of the sudarion would have meaning at all. So, on the basis of what we have already encountered, I would now propose the following translation of John chapter 20, verse 7. Quote, "He, Simon, observed the linen cloths lying, and the sudarion which had been upon his head, not lying with the burial cloths, but separate from view where it was at first." Close quote. This would further require that the sudarion which originally covered Jesus' head at the cross had been repurposed as a chin band, rolled up and then tied or pinned around the face. We have said nothing about Jewish burial practices, but we must now recognize this about the sudarion. Whether or not the sudarion in John chapter 20 is the Sudarium of Oviedo, we cannot possibly think of it as free of blood. Probably since Talmudic times, the victim of unnatural death was clothed in his blood-soaked garments and then placed within a shroud. Namanides Torat Ha'adam and Inyan HaHozaha. It seems very unlikely that the cloth with the victim's blood would be interred in the same tomb as the victim, but in a different location within the same tomb, a separate place by itself. That would be to deny the blood of the victim the same hope of resurrection held for the body. The blood on the sudarion would argue for its placement inside the larger set of burial cloths. We can only conclude that Peter observed the contour of the rolled up sudarion still in its, quote, first place, close quote, where Jesus' face had been within the now empty shroud. This is what John means for us to understand. Only by taking the Greek text this way do we answer problems raised by the themes in John, as well as the words he has chosen. And there are further reasons to justify this translation, in fact, to require it. Coherence. Reasons for my proposal translation include coherence with what John presents elsewhere. As it turns out, in chapter 20, verses 7, chapter verses 20, verses 7 is bracketed by two passages relevant to the tomb scene. The first is John chapter 11, verses 1 through 44, which tells the story of the raising of Lazarus. Lazarus is entombed in a manner like Jesus will soon be entombed. He is wrapped in linens with the cloth tied around his face. Jesus' final statement in this scene is, quote, "Unbind him and let him go," verses 44. Though Lazarus had been brought back to life after 4 days in his tomb, his physical body is still material and tangible. He has been raised to corporeal life, not to full resurrection as Jesus will be. Lazarus must be untied. The scene in Jesus' tomb in chapter 20 contrasts with this. No one is present to untie Jesus, and this is clearly not necessary. Further, the appearance of the linens lying, keimena, resting, speaks against any sign of effort to be freed from the linens. The burial cloths are not scattered or strewn, but lying. And however we are to understand the appearance and the location of the sudarion, it is clearly in an orderly condition. Nothing about this scene is chaotic. What Peter does not yet see is that Jesus has escaped his burial linens in contrast to Lazarus, who had to be unbound. The scene as described in the Greek is consistent with the vanishing and dematerialization of Jesus' body. Later in chapter 20, Jesus will appear in the presence of his disciples, though the doors are locked for fear of the enemies, in verses 19 and 26. If there was any question remaining about the ability of the risen Jesus to pass through physical barriers in this world, it ends here. Jesus' appearance behind locked doors further clarifies what has happened in the tomb. His return to life is different in nature than what has happened to Lazarus. Consequently, he has passed through his burial cloths, all of them, without disturbing any of them. So, revelatory nature. We have yet to discuss the single most important issue for understanding this scene. The configuration of the burial cloths in John chapter 20 is clearly revelatory for the beloved disciple. We cannot accurately choose among translation options without recognizing this fundamental truth. The appearance of the various burial cloths enabled the beloved disciple to see while Peter only observed. Unless the translation helps the reader understand the revelatory nature of the scene, it must give way to something better. The standard way of translating verses 6 and 7 offers no revelatory information at all. There is nothing about a sudarion folded in a separate place that would reveal anything at all to the beloved disciple or to the reader. Eliminating scenarios. Scholars have understood John's description of the tomb and its contents in several ways. We may now undertake a process of elimination. So the first one is, the first scenario is a scattered burial cloths outside the tomb. Some have understood the tomb scene as not confined to the tomb itself. They would have the burial cloths outside the tomb, scattered as if taken off by the risen Jesus. There is no basis for this, as we have seen. Further, there is nothing revelatory about the folded sudarion in this scenario. It becomes a separate, inconsistent mystery with no conceivable explanation. The second scenario is a scattered burial cloths inside the tomb. This proposed scenario is better than the previous one, but it does not take seriously enough the verb kemai, reclining, resting, nor the intended contrast between the Lazarus tomb scene and this tomb scene, nor the revelatory nature of the abandoned burial cloths, especially the sudarion. And then the third possible scenario is orderly burial cloths with the sudarion in a different place. As we have seen, this is the favorite way published translations describe the tomb scene in John 20. They take the Greek preposition choris to mean in a separate place, because the first take Peter's theory observed to mean that he saw the sudarion in plain view. This remains one possible translation of the words of the text. But when we place the text within the larger Gospel of John and ask what John means for us to understand, we must reject this scenario. The difficulty is with the placement of the sudarion, specifically mentioned and undoubtedly important. What was revelatory about a rolled or folded sudarion in a separate place? It might simply have been left there mistakenly by servants of Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus when they had closed the tomb on Friday in haste. Nothing about a visible separate sudarion is revelatory, but whatever the beloved disciple saw was revelatory. It allowed him to see and believe. So the only scenario left is this one presented in the slide, and it is the one that first Peter, then John saw the resting burial cloths with the rolled up, repurposed sudarion's outline under the top layer of the burial shroud, in its first, that means original place. Only this scenario successfully answers all matters of thematic development, of multiple possible word meanings, and of coherence with the rest of the Gospel. Only this scenario holds something truly revelatory for the beloved disciple, and for the reader who understands what John meant. So why it matters? Perhaps other exegetes will insist on a different exegetical conclusion than the one presented here. I encourage them to make the attempt. I might be wrong. We are looking for the truth, after all, but I believe my proposed translation will be impossible to refute. As further research is conducted on the shroud and sudarion, the true biblical picture of the tomb scene must be our reference point, not the scene from published translations which do not take the larger context of John into account. To my knowledge, nothing proposed in this paper contradicts or conflicts with already determined research on the Shroud of Turin or the Sudarium of Oviedo. But suppose, for instance, that one lengthwise bend across the Sudarium holds unrecognized evidence that it contacted the face of the man in the shroud? Or what if the creases lengthwise on the Sudarium could be shown to comport with the rolled up or folded shin bend? What if pinholes on the Sudarium or evidence of a second knot could be found in particular places to substantiate not only the placement of the Sudarium on Jesus' head while his body was on the cross, but also a repurposing of the Sudarium as a chin band within the tomb? The exegesis of John chapter 20, verses 1 through 10, requires us to be open to such possibilities and to explore them. Who can say what else might be discovered in the process? Thank you very much for your attention.